His attitude even lost him some of his popularity with his subjects. Yet before the ensuing spring drew to its close, fortune changed and offered him an unlooked-for compensation. This time the aged monarch, seizing the opportunity provided by the overweening ambition of his rival and political cunning, the Tsar of Bulgaria, decided to strike while the iron was hot. Though it meant breaking the secret convention that bound him to Austria and dealing a cruel blow to his great friendship with Francis Joseph, he forged ahead, and thus, without its costing him a single drop of Romanian blood, enjoyed the proud privilege of dictating the Treaty of Bucharest to the Bulgars, who had been rendered utterly helpless by the entry of his troops into the field. When the cabinet of Vienna urged that this treaty should be submitted to the powers for revision, the king haughtily opposed its claim. No doubt he was privately assured of support from Germany, who was determined to humor Romania in order to keep her under her own thumb, for he telegraphed his gratitude to the Emperor William in a phrase that needs no comment. "Thanks to you, the peace is a conclusive one." We may gather, therefore, that the Berlin cabinet had not followed that of Vienna in its crooked, intriguing policy at Sofia and Bucharest. As Herr von Zimmermann remarked to me at the time, the imperial government was content to observe neutrality towards the Balkan states, interposing only with advice that might cool the frenzy of their strife. There is no reason to question the truth of this statement. The line of conduct adopted by Germany was all the more skillful in that it furthered the military renaissance of Turkey. The success of the plot that secured the dictatorship for Enver Bey and the Young Turks had been hailed with delight at Berlin. When Tsar Ferdinand committed the blunder of withdrawing the Bulgarian garrison from Adrianople in order to cope with his enemies in Macedonia, the second city of the Ottoman Empire fell without a blow into the hands of its former masters. After this easy triumph, the German government, under threat of coercive measures, very difficult, by the way, to carry out, refused to join the Triple Entente powers for the purpose of forcing the Turks to disgorge their prize and restrict themselves to the frontier fixed at the London Conference. Thus the Treaty of London, with the ink upon it scarcely dry, could be torn up with impunity. Turkey's gratitude for this moral support was destined to efface the memory of her abandonment by her former protectress at the time of her early reverses. Finally, under the auspices of German diplomacy, more influential than ever at the Porte, peace was signed in a treaty which deprived the Bulgarians of the greater part of their conquests in Thrace. How far did the cabinet of Berlin, on the morrow of the peace of Bucharest, which it approved, associate itself with a step that has been revealed to us by the remarkable disclosures of Signor Giolitti to the Italian Parliament? Austria-Hungary, eager for action, would fain have crushed Serbia in the full tide of her victory. From the 9th of August, 1913, Vienna made overtures with this object to the Quirinal, but the latter would not listen to its suggestions. If Germany had considered the moment favorable for reopening the Balkan question and satisfying at the same time her European ambitions, she would have ignored Italy's scruples. She would have drawn the sword in company with her impatient ally, as she did a year later. But in the Emperor's opinion, the hour had not yet struck for the execution of his far-reaching designs. Segment 8. In the course of the following winter, a characteristic action showed to the more clear-sighted how important Turkey and her military reorganization had once more become in the eyes of the Berlin staff. One of the ablest German generals, Lehmann von Sanders, was sent with a large mission to Constantinople in order to take over the command of the First Army Corps, revive the German system of training for the Turkish soldier, and reestablish the auxiliary services. To meet the objections raised by the Russian ambassador, the authorities changed his title to that of Inspector General with the rank of Marshal. At the same time, Enver Bey, whose devotion to Germany was notorious, was appointed War Minister, and at once began a process of ruthless weeding out among the higher grade officers. What did this appointment of a German to the head of the army and this radical clearance in the cadre of generals betoken, if not a desire to make the military forces of Turkey fitted as soon as possible and under the most trustworthy leaders to play the part assigned to them in the next war. To make up for this activity, William II displayed an utter indifference to the fate of Albania, although he had done so much towards bringing the new state into the world. More enlightened, no doubt, than his allies as to the chances of life possessed by the sickly offspring of their diplomacy, he had not thought it advisable that a German prince should plot for the Albanian crown, and had left it to the court of Vienna to patronize the claimant. After the first tragicomic episodes of the Durazzo siege, the imperial government, ashamed of the ridicule that this foolish business brought upon the German name, calmly washed its hands of the luckless Prince von Wied. During the last months before the cataclysm, relations became still closer, and the interchange of views still more frequent between the courts of Berlin and Vienna. William II and the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, the real guiding spirit of Austro-Hungarian statecraft, missed no opportunity of seeing each other and conversing at length. They were like two conspirators, furtively laying their heads together for some momentous deed. In April, the Kaiser paid a visit to the Austrian Crown Prince at Miramar, and in June at Konopishte in Bohemia, where he was accompanied by the Secretary of State for the Navy. Both the curiosity of the public and the professional interest of diplomats were aroused by these marks of a friendship that was too intimate not to give cause for anxiety. On the occasion of the Konopishte meeting, the German ambassador in London was instructed to reassure the British Foreign Secretary as to the presence of Admiral von Tirpitz in the Emperor's retinue. The visit, it was stated, had no military object. The ambassador did protest too much. The Admiral, we may be sure, did not leave home in order to enjoy the fragrance of the Bohemian roses. It is more than doubtful, however, whether we shall ever know the purport of these conversations. One of those who took part in them is already in the grave. Did they, at Konopishte, remodel the map of Europe, assign the mastery of the Mediterranean to the Austro-German squadrons, fix the moment for the great upheaval? The Archduke, so far as one can read into the soul of this inscrutable prince, seemed to be the most eager for war. Yet by a decree of fate, he did not live to see the accomplishment of the plans that he drew up in cold blood with his guests amid the exquisite gardens in his lordly mansion. In the spring of 1914, Germany and Austria-Hungary, who both had old scores to pay off in connection with Morocco and the Balkans respectively, reached the zenith of their military preparations. The German army was ready at all points, and the Austro-Hungarian army was as ready as it can ever be. The airships and aeroplanes were only waiting for the signal to leave their sheds. The heavy guns and array of monsters were already marshaled in the artillery parks. All that was wanted was a pretext. As Dr. Schiemann had pointed out in the Kreuz Zeitung, however, Germany could have a war with France merely by letting Austria fly at Serbia's throat. Prophetic words, which a political crime was to bear out, while at the same time it was to give William II the pretext he required for appearing before Europe as an instrument of justice and vengeance. End of section 13.
Hill control.
Section 14 of Germany Before the War by Baron Eugene Napoleon Bayans, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Leinhardt. Chapter 8, The Week of Tragedy, Part 1, Segment 1. The Archduke Francis Ferdinand will go down to posterity without having yielded up his secret. Great political designs have been ascribed to him, mainly on the strength of his friendship with William II. What do we really know about him? That he was strong-willed and obstinate, very clerical, very Austrian, disliking the Hungarians to such an extent that he kept their statesmen at arm's length, and having no love for Italy. He has been credited with sympathies toward the Slav elements of the empire. It has been asserted that he dreamt of setting up, in place of the dual monarchy, a triune state in which the third factor would have been made up for the most part of Slav provinces carved out of the kingdom of St. Stephen. Immediately after he had been murdered, the Vossische Zeitung refuted this theory with arguments which seemed to me thoroughly sound.
Well, that's not very nice.
The Archduke, said the Berlin newspaper, was too keen-witted not to see that he would thus be creating two rivals for Austria instead of one, and that the Serb populations would come within the orbit of Belgrade rather than of Vienna. Serbia would become the Piedmont of the Balkans. She would draw to herself the Slavs of the Danube Valley by a process of crystallization similar to that which brought about Italian unity. From year to year, the Archduke had acquired more and more weight in the governance of the empire, in proportion as his uncle's will grew weaker beneath the burden of advancing age. Thus, he had succeeded in his efforts to provide Austria-Hungary with a new navy, the counterpart, on a more modest scale, of the German fleet, and to reorganize the effective army, here again taking Germany for his model. Among certain cliques, he was accused of not keeping enough in the background, of showing little tact or consideration in his manner of thrusting aside the phantom emperor, who was gently gliding into the winter of his years at Schönbrunn, amid the veneration of his subjects of every race. Another charge was that he appointed too many of his creatures to important civil and military posts. We may well believe that this prince, observing the gradual decay of the monarchy, tried to restore its vigor, and that his first thought was to hold with a firm grasp, even before assuming the imperial crown, the cluster of nationalities, mutually hostile and always discontented, that go to make up the dual empire. So far as foreign relations are concerned, we may assume that he was bent on winning her a place in the first rank of powers, that he wished above all to see her predominant all along the Danube and in the Balkans, that he even aimed at giving her the road to Salonika and the Levant, though it were at the price of a collision with Russia. This antagonism between the two neighbor empires must have often been among the topics of his conversations with William II. The Archduke needed military glory, prestige won on the battlefield, in order to seat his consort firmly on the throne and make his children heirs to the Caesars. He had been suspected, both in Austria and abroad, of not wishing to observe the family compact which he had signed at the time of his marriage with Countess Sophie Chotek. It was thought that he perhaps reserved the right to declare it null and void, in view of the constraint that had been put upon him. The successive honors that had drawn the Duchess of Hohenberg from the obscurity in which the morganatic wife of a German prince is usually wrapped, and had brought her near to the steps of the throne, showed clearly that her rise would not stop halfway. The Archduke, like William II himself, was reputed to be an exemplary father and husband. He was one of those princes who adore their own children, but under the spur of political ambition, are very prone to send the children of others to the shambles. A fine theme for socialist and republican preachers to enlarge upon. I often met the heir to the imperial crown, especially at Vienna in 1910, where I had the honor of accompanying my sovereign, and 2 years later at Munich, at the Prince Regent's funeral. On each occasion, this Habsburg, with his heavy features, his scowling expression, and his rather corpulent figure, quite different from the slim build characteristic of his line, struck me as a singular type. His face was certainly not sympathetic, nor was his manner engaging. The Duchess of Hohenberg, whom, after having known her as a little girl when her father was Austrian minister at Brussels, I found gracefully doing the honors in the Belvedere Palace, had retained in her high station the genial simplicity of the Chotek family. This probably did not prevent her from cherishing the loftiest ambitions for herself, and above all for her eldest son, and from coveting the glory of the double crown. Segment 2. The news that an assassin's hand had struck down the Archduke and his wife, inseparable even in death, burst upon Berlin on the afternoon of Sunday, 28th June, like an unexpected thunderclap in the midst of a calm summer's day. I went over at once to the Austro-Hungarian embassy in order to express all the horror that I felt at this savage drama. Count Soggini, the senior member of the diplomatic corps, was on the eve of resigning the post that he had held for 20 years, honored by all his colleagues. It was whispered that his removal had been asked for by the Archduke, who was anxious to introduce young blood into the diplomatic service. I found the ambassador quite overcome by the terrible news. He seemed stricken with grief at the thought of his aged sovereign, who had already lost so many of his nearest and dearest, and of the dual empire, robbed of its most skillful pilot, and with no one to steer it now but an octogenarian leaning on a youth of 26. Monsieur Cambon had come to the embassy at the same time, and we left together, discussing the results, still impossible to foresee clearly that this fatality might have for European affairs. From the very next day, the tone of the Berlin press, in commenting on the Sarajevo tragedy, was full of menace. It expected the Vienna cabinet to send to Belgrade an immediate request for satisfaction if Serbian subjects, as it was believed, were among those who had devised and carried out the plot. But how far would this satisfaction go, and in what form would it be demanded? There was the rub. The report issued by the semi-official Lokalanzeiger of a pressure exerted by the Austro-Hungarian minister with a view to making the Serbian government institute proceedings against the anarchist societies of which the Archduke and his wife had been the victims, surprised no one, but was not confirmed.
Wait till we get in there.
I hear you.
Damn. Oh.
On the other hand, a softer breeze soon blew from Vienna and Budapest, and under its influence the excitement of the Berlin newspapers suddenly abated. An order seemed to have been issued. The rage and fluster of the public were to be allowed to cool down. The Austro-Hungarian government, so we were informed by the news agencies, were quietly taking steps to prosecute the murderers. Count Berchthold, in speaking to the diplomatic corps at Vienna, and Count Tisza, in addressing Parliament at Budapest, used reassuring language which raised hopes of a peaceful solution. The Wilhelmstrasse also expressed itself in very measured terms on the guarantees that would be demanded from Serbia. Herr Zimmermann, without knowing, so he said to me, what decision had been arrived at in Vienna, thought that no action would be taken in Belgrade until the Austro-Hungarian government had collected the proofs of the complicity of Serbian subjects or societies in the planning of the Sarajevo crime. He had made a similar statement to the Russian ambassador, who had hastened to impart to him his fears for the peace of Europe in the event of any attempt to coerce Serbia into proceeding against the secret societies if they were accused of intrigues against the Austrian government in Bosnia and Croatia. Herr Zimmermann declared to Monsieur Sverbeef that in his opinion no better advice could be given to the Serbian government than this, that it should put a stop to the nefarious work of these societies and punish the accomplices of the Archduke's assassins. The moderation of this remark fairly reflected the general state of public opinion in Berlin. But what of the Emperor, the Archduke's personal friend? Would not his grief and anger find voice in ringing tones? All eyes were turned towards Kiel, where the fatal news reached William II while he was taking part in a yacht race on board his own clipper. He turned pale and was heard to murmur, "So my work of the past 25 years will have to be started all over again." Enigmatic words which may be interpreted in various ways. To the British ambassador, who was also at Kiel, with a British squadron returning from the Baltic, he unburdened himself in more explicit fashion. Es ist ein Verbrechen gegen das Deutschtum. It is a crime against Germanity. By this he probably meant that Germany, feeling her own interests assailed by the Sarajevo crime, would make common cause with Austria to exact a full retribution. With more self-control than usual, however, he abstained from all further public utterances on the subject. It had been announced that he would go to Vienna to attend the Archduke's funeral. What were the motives that prevented him from offering to the dead man this last token of a friendship which, at first merely political, had become genuine and even tender, with a touch of patronage characteristic of the Emperor? He excused himself on the ground of some slight ailment. The truth is, no doubt, that he was disgusted with the wretched stickling for etiquette shown by the Grand Chamberlain of the Viennese court, the Prince di Montenovo, who refused to celebrate with fitting splendor the obsequies of the late heir apparent and his morganatic wife. Under these circumstances, Vienna could have no desire either for the presence of William II or for his criticisms. At the beginning of July, the Emperor left for his accustomed cruise along the Norwegian coast, and in Berlin we breathed more freely. If he could withdraw so easily from the center of things, it was a sign that the storm clouds that had nearly burst over Serbia were also passing off from the Danube Valley. Such, I fancy, was the view taken by the British government, for its ambassador, who was already away on leave, was not sent back to Berlin. Other diplomats, among them the Russian ambassador, took their annual holiday as usual. But the Emperor, in the remote fjords of Norway, was all the time posted up in the secret designs of the Vienna cabinet. The approaching ultimatum to Serbia was telegraphed to him direct by his ambassador in Vienna, Herr von Chersky, a very active worker who strenuously advocated a policy of hostility towards Russia, and from the first moment had wanted war. We may assume that the Emperor, if his mind was not already made up at Kiel, came to a decision during his Norwegian cruise. His departure for the north had been merely a snare, a device for throwing Europe and the Triple Entente off the scent, and for lulling them into a false security. While the world imagined that he was merely seeking to soothe his nerves and recruit his strength with his salt sea breezes, he was biding his time for a dramatic reappearance on the stage of events, allowing the introductory scenes to be played in his absence. Segment 3. During the first half of July, my colleagues and I at Berlin did not live in a fool's paradise. As the deceptive calm caused by Vienna's silence was prolonged, a latent, ill-defined uneasiness took hold of us more and more. Yet we were far from anticipating that in the space of a few days we should be driven into the midst of a diplomatic maelstrom, in which, after a week of intense anguish, we should look on, mute and helpless, at the shipwreck of European peace and of all our hopes. The ultimatum, sent in the form of a note by Baron von Giesel to the Serbian cabinet on 23rd July, was not disclosed by the Berlin newspapers until the following day in their morning editions. This bolt from the blue proved more alarming than anything we had dared to imagine. The shock was so unexpected that certain journals, losing their composure, seemed to regard the Vienna cabinet's arraignment as having overshot the mark. Austria-Hungary, said the Vossische Zeitung, will have to justify the grave charges that she makes against the Serbian government and people by publishing the results of the preliminary investigations at Sarajevo. My own conviction, shared by several of my colleagues, was that the Austrian and Hungarian statesmen could not have brought themselves to risk such a blow at the Balkan kingdom without having consulted their colleagues at Berlin and ascertained that the Emperor William would sanction the step. His horror of regicides and his keen sense of dynastic brotherhood might explain why he left his ally a free hand, in spite of the danger of provoking a European conflict. That danger was only too real. Not for one moment did I suppose that Russia would prove so careless of Serbia's fate as to put up with this daring assault on the latter's sovereignty and independence, that the St. Petersburg cabinet would renounce the principle of the Balkans for the Balkan nations, proclaimed to the Duma 2 months before by Monsieur Sazonov. In short, that the Russian people would disown the ancient ties of blood that united it with the Slav communities of the Balkan Peninsula. The pessimistic feeling of the diplomatic corps was increased on the following day, the 25th, by the language addressed to it at the Wilhelmstrasse. Baron von Jago and Zimmermann said that they had not known beforehand the contents of the Austrian note. This was a mere quibble. They had not known its actual wording, I grant, but they had certainly been apprised of its tenor. They hastened to add, by the way, that the imperial government approved of its allies' conduct and did not consider the tone of its communication unduly harsh. The Berlin press, still with the exception of the socialist organs, had recovered from its astonishment of the day before. It joined in the chorus of the Vienna and Budapest newspapers, from which it gave extracts, and faced the prospect of a war with perfect calm, while expressing the hope that it would remain localized. In comparison with the attitude of the German government and press, the signs pointing to a peaceful settlement seemed faint indeed. They all came from outside Germany, from the impressions recorded in foreign telegrams. Public opinion in Europe could not grasp the need for such hectoring methods of obtaining satisfaction, when there was no case for refusing discussion on the normal diplomatic lines. It seemed impossible that Count Berthold should ignore the general movement of reproof which appeared spontaneously everywhere but in Berlin against his ultimatum. A moderate claim would have seemed just, but Serbia could not be asked to accept a demand for so heavy an atonement, couched in a form of such unexampled brutality. The more I reflected on the ghastly situation created by the collusion of German and Austro-Hungarian diplomacy, the more certain did I feel that the key to that situation, as Monsieur Sazonov said later, lay in Berlin, and that there was no need to look further for the solution of the problem. If, however, the choice between peace and war was left to the discretion of the Emperor William, whose influence over his ally in Vienna had always overruled that of others, then, considering what I knew as to His Majesty's personal inclinations and the plans of the General Staff, the upshot of it all was no longer in doubt, and no hope of a peaceful arrangement could any longer be entertained. I communicated this dismal forecast to the French ambassador, whom I went to see on the evening of the 25th. Like myself, Monsieur Cambon labored under no illusions. That very night I wrote to my government in order to acquaint it with my fears and urge it to be on its guard. This report, dated the 26th, I entrusted, as a matter of precaution, to one of my secretaries, who at once left for Brussels. Early next morning, my dispatch was in the hands of the Belgian foreign minister. The ultimatum to Serbia, it ran, is a blow contrived by Vienna and Berlin, or rather contrived here and carried out at Vienna. Requital for the assassination of the Austrian heir apparent and the pan-Serb propaganda serves as a stalking horse. The real aim, apart from the crushing of Serbia and the stifling of Yugoslav aspirations, is to deal a deadly thrust at Russia and France with the hope that England will stand aside from the struggle. In order to vindicate this theory, I beg to remind you of the view prevailing in the German General Staff, namely that a war with France and Russia is unavoidable and close at hand, a view which the Emperor has been induced to share. This war, eagerly desired by the military and pan-German party, might be undertaken today under conditions extremely favorable for Germany, conditions that are not likely to arise again for some time to come." End quote. After a summary of the situation and of the problems that it raised, my report concluded as follows. We too have to ask ourselves these harassing questions and keep ourselves ready for the worst, for the European conflict that has always been talked about with the hope that it would never break out is today becoming a grim reality. End quote. The worst contingencies that occurred to me as a Belgian were the violation of a part of our territory and the duty that might fall upon our soldiers of barring the way to the belligerents. In view of the vast area over which a war between France and Germany would be fought, dared we hope that Belgium would be safe from any attack by the German army, from any attempt to use their strategic routes for offensive purposes? I could not bring myself to believe that she would be so fortunate. But between such tentatives and a thoroughgoing invasion of my country, plotted a long time in advance and carried out before the real operations of the war had begun, there was a wide gulf, a gulf that I never thought the imperial government capable of leaping over with a light heart, because of the European complications which so reckless a disdain for treaties would not fail to involve. Segment 4. Until the end of the crisis, the idea of a preventive war continually recurred to my mind. Other heads of legations, however, while sharing my anxieties on this point, did not agree with me as to the premeditation of which I accused the Emperor and the military chiefs. I was not content with putting my questions to the French ambassador, whose unerring judgment always carried great weight with me. I also visited his Italian colleague, an astute diplomat, thoroughly versed in German statecraft. He had always put me in mind of those dexterous agents employed by the 16th century Italian republics. According to Signor Bolatti, the German government, agreeing in principle with the Vienna cabinet as to the necessity for chastising Serbia, had not known beforehand the terms of the Austrian note, the violence of which was unprecedented in the language of chancelleries. Vienna, as well as Berlin, was convinced that Russia, in spite of the official assurances that had recently passed between the Tsar and Monsieur Poincaré regarding the complete readiness of the French and Russian armies, was not in a position to enter on a European war, and that she would not dare to embark upon so hazardous an adventure. Internal troubles, revolutionary intrigues, incomplete armaments, inadequate means of communication, all these reasons would compel the Russian government to be an impotent spectator of Serbia's undoing. The same confidence reigned in the German and Austrian capitals as regards not the French army, but the spirit prevailing among government circles in Paris. At present, added the ambassador, feeling runs so high in Vienna that all calm reflection goes by the board. Moreover, in seeking to annihilate Serbia's military power, the Austro-Hungarian cabinet is pursuing a policy of personal revenge. It cannot realize the mistakes that it made during the Balkan War, or remain satisfied with the partial successes then gained with our aid. Successes that, whatever judgment may be passed upon them, were certainly diplomatic victories. All that Count Berchtold sees today is Serbia's insolence and the criticism he has had to endure even in Austria. By this bold stroke, very unexpected from a man of his stamp, he hopes to turn the criticism into applause." End quote. The ambassador held that Berlin had false ideas as to the course that the Tsar's government would adopt. The latter would find itself forced into drawing the sword in order to maintain its prestige in the Slav world. Its inaction, in face of Austria's entry into the field, would be equivalent to suicide. Signor Bolatti also gave me to understand that a widespread conflict would not be popular in Italy. The Italian people had no concern with the overthrow of the Russian power, which was Austria's enemy. It wished to devote all its attention to other problems, more absorbing from its own point of view. The blindness of the Austrian cabinet with regard to Russian intervention has been proved by the correspondence since published of the French and British representatives at Vienna. The Viennese populace was beside itself with joy at the announcement of an expedition against Serbia, which it felt sure would be a mere military parade. Not for a single night were Count Berthold's slumbers disturbed by the vision of the Russian peril. He is indeed at all times a buoyant soul who can happily mingle the distractions of a life of pleasure with the heavy responsibilities of power. His unvarying confidence was shared by the German ambassador, his most trusted mentor. We can hardly suppose that the Austrian minister shut his eyes altogether to the possibility of a struggle with the Slav world. Having Germany as his partner, however, he determined, with the self-possession of a fearless gambler, to proceed with the game. At Berlin, the theory that Russia was incapable of facing a conflict reigned supreme, not only in the official world and in society, but among all the manufacturers who made a specialty of war material. Herr Krupp von Bohlen, who was more entitled to give an opinion than any other of his class, declared on 28 July, at a table near mine in the Hotel Bristol, that the Russian artillery was neither efficient nor complete, while that of the German army had never before been so superior to all its rivals. It would be madness on Russia's part, he inferred, to take the field against Germany and Austria under these conditions. Segment 5. The foreign diplomatic corps was kept in more or less profound ignorance as to the pourparlers carried on since the 24th by the Imperial Foreign Office with the Triple Entente cabinets. Nevertheless, to the diplomats who were continually going over to the Wilhelmstrasse for news, the crisis was set forth in a light very favorable to Austria and Germany in order to influence the views of the governments which they represented. Herr von Stumm, the departmental head of the political branch, in a brief interview that I had with him on the 26th, summed up his exposition in these words: "Everything depends on Russia. I should rather have thought that everything depended on Austria and on the way in which she would carry out her threats against Serbia." On the following day, I was received by Herr Zimmermann, who adopted the same line of argument, following it in all its bearings from the origin of the dispute. "It was not at our prompting," he said, "or in accordance with our advice that Austria took the action that you know of towards the Belgrade cabinet. The answer was unsatisfactory, and today Austria is mobilizing. She can no longer draw back without risking a collapse at home as well as a loss of influence abroad. It is now a question of life and death to her. She must put a stop to the unscrupulous propaganda which, by raising revolt among the Slav provinces of the Danube Valley, is leading towards her internal disintegration. Finally, she must exact a signal revenge for the assassination of the Archduke. For all these reasons, Serbia is to receive, by means of a military expedition, a stern and salutary lesson. An Austro-Serbian war is therefore impossible to avoid. England has asked us to join with her, France, and Italy in order to prevent the conflict from spreading and a war from breaking out between Austria and Russia. Our answer was that we should be only too glad to help in limiting the area of the conflagration by speaking in a pacific sense to Vienna and St. Petersburg, but that we could not use our influence with Austria to restrain her from inflicting an exemplary punishment on Serbia. We have promised to help and support our Austrian allies if any other nation should try to hamper them in this task. We shall keep that promise. If Russia mobilizes her army, we shall at once mobilize ours, and then there will be a general war, a war that will set ablaze all Central Europe and even the Balkan Peninsula, for the Romanians, Greeks, Bulgarians, and Turks will not be able to resist the temptation to come in. As I remarked yesterday to Monsieur Bogicevic, the former Serbian chargé d'affaires, who was on a flying visit to Berlin, where he had been greatly appreciated during the Balkan War, the best advice I can give Serbia is that she should make no more than a show of resistance to Austria and should come to terms as soon as possible by accepting all the conditions of the Vienna cabinet. I added, in speaking to him, that if a universal war broke out and went in favor of the Triplice, Serbia would probably cease to exist as a nation. She would be wiped off the map of Europe. I still hope, though, that such a widespread conflict may be avoided, and that we shall succeed in inducing Russia not to intervene on Serbia's behalf. Remember that Austria is determined to respect Serbia's integrity once she has obtained satisfaction." End quote. I pointed out to the Undersecretary that the Belgrade Cabinet's reply, according to some of my colleagues who had read it, was, apart from a few unimportant restrictions, an unqualified surrender to Austria's demands. Herr Zimmermann said that he had no knowledge of this reply. It had been handed in 2 days before to the Austrian minister at Belgrade, and that, in any case, there was no longer any possibility of preventing an Austro-Hungarian military demonstration. The Serbian document was not published by the Berlin newspapers until the 29th. On the previous day, they had all reproduced a telegram from Vienna stating that this apparent submission was altogether inadequate. The prompt concessions made by the Passage Cabinet, concessions that had not been anticipated abroad, failed to impress Germany. She persisted in seeing only with Austria's eyes. Herr Zimmermann's arguments held good solely on the hypothesis that, in the action brought by Austria against Serbia, no power had the right to come forward as counsel for the defendant or to interfere in the trial at all. This claim amounted to depriving Russia of her historic role in the Balkans. Carried to its logical conclusion, the theory meant condemning unheard every small state that should be unfortunate enough to have a dispute with a great power. According to the principles of the Berlin Cabinet, the great power should be allowed, without let or hindrance, to proceed to the execution of its weak opponent. England, therefore, would have had no right to succor Belgium when the latter was invaded by Germany, any more than Russia had a right to protect Serbia from the Austrian menace. Russia, it was asserted at the Wilhelmstrasse, ought to be satisfied with the assurance that Austria would not impair the territorial integrity of Serbia or mar her future existence as an independent state. What a hollow mockery such a promise would seem when the whole country had been ravaged by fire and sword. Surely it was decreed that, after this exemplary punishment, Serbia should become the lowly vassal of her redoubtable neighbor, living a life that was no life, cowed by the jealous eye of the Austrian minister, really the Austrian viceroy, at Belgrade. Had not Count Mensdorff declared to Sir Edward Grey that before the Balkan War, Serbia was regarded as gravitating towards the dual monarchy's sphere of influence? A return to the past, to the tame deference of King Milan, was the least that Austria would exact. The version given out by the Imperial Chancellery, besides being intended to enlighten foreign governments, had a further end in view. Repeated ad nauseum by the press, it aimed at misleading German public opinion. From the very opening of the crisis, Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg and his colleagues strove, with all the ingenuity at their command, to hoodwink their countrymen, to shuffle the cards, to throw beforehand on Russia, in case the situation should grow worse, the odium of provocation and the blame for the disaster, to represent that power as meddling with a police inquiry that did not concern her in the least. This cunning maneuver resulted in making all Germany, without distinction of class or party, respond to her emperor's call at the desired moment, since she was persuaded, as I have explained in a previous chapter, that she was the object of a premeditated attack by Tsarism. End of section 14.
For the ones ensuring the job always gets done, and the ones wearing many hats, Grainger offers professional.
We have the ball.
Part 2, huh? I'll pause it right there. Switch it up, start with magic. And overkill, huh?
Ball dropped. Ball out of bounds. Ball incoming. Enemy has
Universal
the ball.
War. Very enticing.
Ball dropped. Enemy has the ball.
I'm not familiar
Ball
with Germany
dropped.
and French and Russian and all that, so especially in 1914. I'm listening. Lord of the Cylinder? Am I gonna have to get the cylinder out?
Enemy has the ball. Ball dropped. Enemy has the ball.
Pretty sure there's one on that.
Ball dropped.
Maybe that'll give us some
Enemy
information in
halfway
the
to
newspaper
victory.
article.
We have the ball. Ball dropped.
Trying to
Enemy
make a
has the
fashion
ball.
statement at a time like this? No, thank you.
Ball dropped. We have the ball.
This isn't a dog park, do you understand?
Ball dropped.
The puppy bowl.
Enemy has the
Nah,
ball.
bro.
Ball dropped. Enemy has the ball. Ball dropped. We have the ball.
What was that little red thing? What was that? Reticle. Did you see that? I've never seen that in my life. Like some Terminator red circle. That was crazy. Nah, dude, I'm good on that. Nah, we're good.
Gained the lead. Nearing victory.
Look at this magnet. Thank you, though.
Ball dropped.
Call it a day on that one.
Enemy has the ball. Ball dropped. Enemy has the ball.
Germany, huh?
Ball dropped. We have the ball. Round one.
You got some big egos, bro. Big ego.
Ball incoming. Enemy has the ball. Ball dropped. Enemy has the ball. Ball dropped. have the ball. Halfway to victory. Ball dropped. Ball out of bounds. Ball incoming. Enemy has the ball. Ball dropped. We have the ball. Ball dropped.
I knew it too. As soon as I saw it. It's the magic, huh? What are you doing, Germany?
Ball dropped. Enemy has the ball. Ball dropped. Enemy has the ball. Ball dropped. Ball dropped. Enemy has the ball. 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 Ball dropped. We have the ball. Nearing victory. Ball dropped. We have the ball. Victory.
That'll do it. Let's start another one. Good games. I mean, other than that one. It was over anyway, but. We'll be back. Maybe I'll figure this newspaper article out. Lord of the Cylinder. I thought about doing that, but now that I see this, I'm glad I didn't. I think it's telling me what it is. Look at this overkill, though. Right at the end, look at this, Preb.